Last year's arrest in Russia of the billionaire businessman Mikhail Khodorkovsky has provoked mixed feelings. Outrage and cries of political witch hunt from his supporters, lukewarm expressions of concern from Europe and America, and as for the Russian people, well, they don't like the oligarchs anyway. My guest today is one of Khodorkovsky's lawyers. Is his client a political prisoner or just a high-stakes gambler who ran out of luck? Bob Amsterdam, very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
In your words, your client is a genius, a true genius. I consider him to be one of the outstanding people of the times. The term historical catastrophe would be absolutely appropriate here, meaning the way he's being treated now. Why? He's no saint, is he?
He's no saint. He's a fabulous patriot in terms of Russia, and his belief in transparency, his lobbying for transparency, his speaking on behalf of civil society, when many others have shied away from that, his open willingness to stake a political ground sets him apart from the vast number of people who have great wealth in Russia.
It may set him apart now, but it didn't in the early 90s, did it? And some of the charges against him, we've got 7 charges of embezzlement, theft, and tax evasion. Some of them date back to the privatization process of the early 90s. He wasn't a saint then, was he?
Well, they have to date back to privatization because, in fact, the rules, he tried to abide by the rules as they existed. But the real question is, why was Mr. Yeltsin granted immunity? If that chapter was to be reopened, why was Khodorkovsky the only one charged? These are transparently political
charges. But it doesn't matter. The charges leveled against him. It doesn't matter what everybody else was doing. It never does in a court of law, does it? Well, they have chosen to level these charges against him, not against President Yeltsin, who in any case got immunity once Putin came into office.
You've just explained part of the nature of the defense. You can't actually selectively prosecute, give immunity to the very government people involved. Because if you really want to look...
Who says you can't?
Who says you can't? International law says you can't. There is something called the European Convention of Human Rights that says you can't, that says you have to have an impartial tribunal. And that impartial tribunal is very difficult to find in the Russia of today.
Your own client said, I don't set myself up as a shining example, nor have I ever said that I've been a model citizen. What's the subtext here? I've done some pretty questionable things. That's what he's saying, isn't he?
No, what he's saying is he's not a saint. He's not Nelson Mandela. He's somebody who struggled from the years in the Komsomol. He set up one of the first banks in Russia. He handled his business at a time when there barely were any rules, and he did the best he could in a literally revolutionary environment.
He didn't need rules to tell him what was right or wrong, did he? He didn't need laws to tell him what was right or wrong. Here he was, by his own definition, a model Soviet citizen. So he knew the difference between right and wrong. And when he says, not everything was ethical, this is not something for me to be proud of. Those were tough times. The way we dealt with minority shareholders was not ethical. He knew he did wrong, didn't he?
Absolutely not.
That's what he's saying.
But let's be
That is what he's saying.
Let's put it in context.
The New Yorker, 13th of October last year.
That's fine. Let's put it in context. Let's look at other companies. You know, the major minority shareholder suit against Khodorkovsky that's often utilized is the DART suit, where DART got his information, publicly audited statements. He was the only one at the time to have them.
He's admitting that the way they dealt with minority shareholders was not ethical. What's he saying here? He's saying, I did some pretty lousy things that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. That's what he's saying.
No, that's not what he's saying.
And the Russian state is saying, now comes the scrutiny. Here we go.
No, let's put it into context. Hardly at long last. If you're going to start investigating privatization, let's look at privatization, and let's look closely at the politicians and the other businessmen around privatization.
But it doesn't matter what the other people did. They've chosen to level a case against him. Maybe they'll get to the others. Maybe they'll get to the other. They don't have to try to satisfy you. They would have to put everybody on trial at the same time.
No.
They don't need to in a court of law.
No.
They have 280 volumes of case materials, so clearly they've done some work.
All they need is an open and fair trial in this case. All they need is to demonstrate the fact that the prosecution of Khodorkovsky isn't political, but it abjectly is, because the reasons behind this phony prosecution relate to nothing about the early 90s. They relate to the political issues today in Russia.
That's not what Putin is saying. He's saying says there are people who in the space of 5 to 6 years made billions of dollars. There is no Western European country where this would have been possible. Having made these billions, they now spend tens or hundreds of millions to save those fortunes. We know how this money is spent, on what lawyers, companies, PR firms, and what politicians. So he knows. It's not political as far as he's concerned. He's decided that the blind eye should open. They turned a blind eye all these years to the things that went on in the heady days of privatization, and now they've decided not to. His luck ran out. That's what it is, isn't it?
Absolutely not. It's got nothing to do with his luck. It's got to do with the fact that he pushed Russia to be transparent. He got involved in politics. He got involved in pushing in the Duma against production sharing agreements, which would have allowed corrupt Russian politicians to put the money for oil in their pockets. That's what this is about. This is about trying to push an oil pipeline to China to benefit Russia and not letting the lackeys of the FSB line their pockets
with FSB is the Internal Security Service.
That's right. Not have them line their pockets with money going to the transaction with Japan. That's what this is all about. It's about his support for Yabloko. It's about his fighting against the attack by Mr. Putin on the independent media. It is unjustifiable. It is not defensible that there is no independent media outside of a handful of brave radio stations and newspapers.
That's not on trial here.
It is on trial.
Your client is on trial.
No. Russia's on trial. Absolutely. They decided to take the one major opponent of the president and put him in jail during the election. Russia is on trial.
Your client, Mr. Amsterdam, played for very high stakes in a very rough game in a very rough time in the early 90s. He knew he was gambling with fire, and he knew what the risks were, and yet he went ahead and did it anyway. Why should we feel sorry for a man whose luck simply ran out?
Let's look at the situation in terms of who we should feel sorry for. Khodorkovsky is illegally in jail. We don't need to feel sorry for him. Let's just get some fair rules of the game.
What do you mean illegally? They've charged him.
No, illegally. He's in jail because he deserves bail under the Russian legal system, and he's not gotten it. There's no reason for him to be incarcerated. There's no reason for his lawyers to be harassed. There is no reason for illegal wiretaps.
Who's harassed the lawyers?
The procuracy. The prosecutors. October 9th, they went into Mr. Drell's office, one of the lead attorneys. They ransacked his office without a warrant when they thought he was doing a bail hearing. They took documents critical to the defense, and they removed them. And it's the same FSB, the secret police, who shouldn't in any way be involved in normal investigations, who did this.
But it's up to the Russians who's involved in the investigations and who isn't. I mean, you can't control everything for them. You put Russia on trial, you put the Internal Security Service on trial, you want everybody else to stand trial who was involved in the privatization process at the time. You can't have everything, you know, can you?
No,
it's your client who's on trial here,
let's be very
clear. And he's
clear.
The one you're representing, not everybody else.
In 1996, Russia agreed as part of its entry into the Council of Europe that the FSB would stop running penitentiaries and that the FSB would stop being involved in prosecutions. They have breached those undertakings. They are treaty undertakings. They are in breach, and no Western power has yet brought them to account for that.
And what does that tell you? That no Western power is shouting about your client. Maybe they don't buy the hard luck story.
Well, that's not actually the case, and that's not what I said. Western powers are shouting about my client. Mr. Bindig, today in Moscow, stated publicly, he's a member of the Council of Europe. He's a former rapporteur on Chechnya. He stated in Moscow today, this is a political case, the case against
But you yourself have spoken about a conspiracy of silence among Western leaders.
Yes, among certain Western leaders I have. But let's look at the last number of weeks. Powell goes to Moscow, issues that statement in Izvestia. The Swedish foreign minister...
What statement? It's not a statement about your client in Izvestia.
There are code words you can use.
He didn't mention your client.
He doesn't have to mention it. When he talks about the lack of rule of law...
He's talking about the elections. That's what it was interpreted to
No,
be.
He's talking about the lack of an independence of the judiciary. That's what he's talking about. And that's a term we've coined called Basmani justice. The justice that's being meted out in closed hearings at Basmani Court in Moscow.
Isn't it a little rich that you want to apply Western standards and Western ethics to the treatment of Khodorkovsky, and yet when he was making his billions, he didn't play by Western rules any more than the government, did he?
No, let's be.
He made up his own rules, and you're accusing them of making up theirs.
No, let's be
There's a contradiction there.
No,
you're crying foul because they're using what you claim to be the same methods that he used, lawlessness.
Mr. Sebastian, you're wrong, because what I'm talking about are Russian rules. I am not attacking them for breaching Western rules. They're breaching their own code of criminal procedure. They're breaching their own obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights. Those are the rules they're breaching, not Western rules. I'm holding them to the standards of the new Criminal Procedure Code, which Mr. Putin, also a lawyer, put in 40 amendments to. That's what I'm holding them to. Under that, these political prisoners should be released. I'm not saying it's rich. You know what's rich? That they're trying to argue that this is a real prosecution when Mr. Lebedev, one of the other individuals involved, is going blind, and Mr. Pichugin, a security officer at Yukos, is near death. That's what's rich. That the West doesn't speak out on behalf of those individuals. That's what's shocking.
How do you know that he's going blind as a result of the treatment he's received, or that Pichugin is dying as a result of the treatment he's received?
On July 14th, Pichugin
These are two former associates.
Well, from the Russian associates, absolutely. No. From the Russian lawyers. Tatiana Akimtseva, who sees Pichugin, who's watched him lose 70 pounds in jail. Evgeny Baru, the Russian lawyer for Mr. Lebedev, who sees him every day. Those are the people that tell me about their physical conditions. I saw Khodorkovsky in December at Basmani Court, and I'm not screaming about Khodorkovsky. Khodorkovsky's lost weight and doesn't look great, but that's very different from the situation of Lebedev and Pichugin.
In the year 2000, when Putin was first elected, there was a widely reported deal with the oligarchs. In fact, your client referred to it. He said, "I recall our discussions with the president and absolutely agree that business cannot and should not participate in politics." So the deal was that the rich men could keep their money, but they would stay out of politics. Why did he violate that deal?
That wasn't the deal.
Well, that seems to be his recollection of it.
Well, actually,
and he told the Financial Times, "I recall our discussions and absolutely agree that businesses cannot and should not participate in politics." That's a quote from him.
Well, I can tell you the deal as I understand it. And the deal was, the meeting was held in early 2000, and the deal related to the media assets of certain oligarchs. And those media assets were not to be deployed in a manner that made the playing field uneven. Nowhere did Khodorkovsky give up his civil and political rights. And the idea that somehow there was some deal where he would violates any sense of fair play.
So you dissociate him from this quote, then?
Well, I don't think that's a complete quote.
It's a quote from the Financial Times.
Well, it's just unfortunately not
businesses
complete.
cannot and should not participate in politics. It seems pretty clear that this was some kind of an historic compromise, wasn't it? Keep your money, but play by my rules. This is what Putin was telling them.
Well, it's not a compromise that my client recollects in that way. And I also think that it's a compromise, you know, if what we're trying to do is blame Mr. Khodorkovsky for trying to participate in politics.
No, I'm not blaming him. I'm merely pointing out that he had political ambitions. He did have political ambitions, didn't he?
No, he didn't. He had ambitions and hopes for Russia. And it's those hopes that drove him to fly back into Russia, knowing the imminence of possible arrest.
But he said he was going to give up business at the age of 45, didn't he? He was putting some of his personal money into other political parties, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Absolutely right, he was. And that's not a crime in any system.
No, but the president of the American Foreign Policy Council, Herman Kirchner, says that Khodorkovsky was clearly looking to build major power in the Duma and run for the presidency. You're saying that's a wrong impression? Because that's a widely held impression outside Russia as well.
It's a wrong impression. In fact, if you look at Khodorkovsky's last speech before he was illegally arrested, he said at the Carnegie Institute he wanted to put all his efforts towards the growth of a civil society in Russia. This is the greatest philanthropist in Russian history. He built internet school after internet school. He was setting up universities. He's the only person of great wealth who did all of this without any notion of self-aggrandizement.
But he's changed, hasn't he? He said by himself in his New Yorker interview, there were 2 watersheds in my life. He's changed. He wasn't always that great philanthropist.
No, that's true.
He was that ruthless businessman, either sailing very close to the wind, or if you accept the Russian version, crossing the line.
I don't believe he crossed the line, but there's no question that particularly the DART incident had a very powerful impact on him. He grew up. He recognized he had been transparent. He had those financial statements, and he recognized before anyone else in his society what transparency could mean to Russia. It is something that Mr. Putin is fighting today. It is something that the FSB is fighting, because the one thing that's most dangerous to them is transparency. And that is obvious from the recent OSCE report on the Duma election. It's obvious obvious from the recent report by Standard & Poor's, which is saying that in Russia today, there's a warning about authoritarianism. Standard & Poor's is saying there's a risk to investors. You can't equate personal popularity with stability for investors. That's a very important message.
Let's look at some of the methods that Mikhail Khodorkovsky is supposed to have used when he set up the Menotep Bank, for instance. Mikhail Friedman, another oligarch, chief of the Alpha Group, said that Menotep used to make very high investment pledges. They would then back them with Menotep guarantees, which would then run out before the investment had been made. They had a whole system in which to do that. Is that an ethical way to behave?
To be frank with you, I've never heard this quote before. I'd want to put it in context. I'd want to understand the scenario. I know in the
but
one
you represent
case,
the man who.
well, I know in the one case he's charged with, he actually invested more in that particular company than the investment program he's alleged to have violated. So everything has to be seen in context. I don't agree with it.
Would you accept, though, that his group, his bank, made a name for itself with strong-arm tactics and intimidation of minority shareholders?
I wouldn't accept that. I would say to you that the standards used with minority shareholders in the 90s have improved significantly today.
He himself said they were unethical.
Well,
the way they behaved with the minority shareholders.
To be frank with you, I didn't represent him at that time, and I'm not going to profess to comment on his quote.
You haven't read the quote?
I haven't seen the quote.
We'll give it to you.
Thank you.
13th of October, New Yorker.
Thank you.
Why has he not got much support from the business community? Why isn't the business community, if this is such a threat to business in Russia, why aren't they rallying around him? They should be, shouldn't they?
Well, let's look at the business community, because we have to look at the way they're acting relative to the new Russia today. Lukoil made a statement a couple months ago that it will no longer try to even reduce taxes. In a Western country, the board would be thrown out. In Russia, Putin rewards them. A few days ago, they won a massive contract in Saudi Arabia. Now, you're in a totally untransparent society where proximity to the Kremlin is the only thing that counts.
And your client knew that.
My client was trying to change it. That's what my client was doing. He was trying to change it so that proximity to the Kremlin didn't automatically mean power. He was trying to make a level playing field that never existed in Russia before, and that's why he's in jail.
And he knew the risks. If that's what he was doing, he knew the risks.
Yes, he did. Let me be very clear. He knew the risk. When he flew back into Russia the final time, and he knew he might go to jail, he knew the risks. So whatever was said about his past, this is a man of principle. This is a man of real principle, because unlike many, he gave up a tremendous amount when he walked into that Russian jail cell, knowing the conditions, the historical conditions of Russian jails.
If what you say is true, why doesn't Russian business support him? You've answered that. But why don't the majority of people in Russia have some feeling towards this man who is, by your account, so unjustly dealt with? We have opinion polls saying that more than 70%, this was in October 2003, say they dislike the oligarchs. 60% say they're not good for Russia. Some 60% say the oligarchs do more harm than good to Russia. Why is he and others like him who've made so much money? You call him a patriot. You say he's done tremendous things for Russia.
Yes,
why are they so unpopular?
Well,
if they're honest.
I'll tell you. When you've got a state-controlled media, you can make almost anyone unpopular.
State-controlled television. The newspapers are not controlled.
Not all of the newspapers.
In fact, he controls the newspaper himself.
Well, let's be really clear. Did you read the recent New York Times piece on how the influence, the intimidation in all media is all pervasive? I don't buy any of the opinion polls. You've got a society where controls have been reinstated that we thought had all gone away. I mean, we've got secret hearings in this case happening. Precedent setting, secret hearings, as if you're back in Stalin's time. This is a situation that is completely untenable for a country that is supposed to be a partner with Europe in a common area of justice. This is shocking. The conditions in Russian prisons, the fact that Lebedev's going blind with uncontrolled blood pressure when he's been charged with an economic crime, the fact that Mikhail Khodorkovsky is brought into prison as if he was some terrorist with 30 armed Spetsnaz, special forces, bringing him in. It's all part of this attempt to criminalize the opposition. That's what those charges are. They're not real charges.
He's not the opposition.
They're
He's not charged with political crimes anymore, is he?
No, they're piling on new charges all the time.
How many new charges? How many new charges since he was arrested?
Well, in Lebedev's
in the case of Khodorkovsky, how many new charges have we got?
In Lebedev's case, we've had a series in the last few weeks relating to tax
Khodorkovsky
evasion.
we're talking about. How many new charges in his case?
I believe there's one additional tax charge.
One additional, okay. The conditions that he's held in are satisfactory. Is that right?
Let's be clear.
The Russian Deputy Justice Minister says his conditions meet international requirements. Is that right?
That's actually wrong. No. He's in pretrial detention. He's not been convicted of anything. There shouldn't be 4 people in his cell. So no, I disagree. And the conditions in which Lebedev and Pichugin are in, including the torture of Pichugin, have absolutely nothing to do with international standards. It is an absolute nightmare that Russia believes it can get away with torturing somebody and not at least launching an investigation. All the Russian defense
team has launched an investigation. In fact, it's got the Swiss to launch an investigation as well.
No, I'm talking about torture. I'm talking about torture. And no, in fact, all the Swiss have done is comply with the treaty obligation.
They've carried out several raids at offices in connection with the Russian investigation into Yukos, haven't they? They have carried out several raids. They have seized documents.
That's right.
We now hear today that they have frozen $5 billion in bank accounts held by some of the top shareholders. All this just in line with treaty obligations?
Yes.
Or because they believe there's a prima facie case here?
The news you're hitting me with this morning is news. As far as I'm concerned, up until that moment, there has been absolutely nothing in terms of a prima facie case. And of course, until I see what the Swiss have done, I'm not going to comment on it.
But it would certainly suggest that the Swiss believe there is a case to be answered somewhere along the line. Otherwise, they simply wouldn't comply.
Actually, not necessarily so. Not under international treaties. They don't have. There's clearly been no hearing. So there may be simply a temporary freeze until a hearing can take place.
What do you want other countries to do? I mean, I said that the support from other countries, particularly the European Union, has been lukewarm, to say the least. What do you actually expect countries to do about Khodorkovsky? They've got more important things to worry about, haven't they?
I don't think there's more important things to worry about than the rule of law in Russia. Khodorkovsky is emblematic of the gross deterioration of the rule of law, the end of an independent, any thought of the development of an independent judiciary.
Why? He's only one oligarch on jail. If there were 12 on jail, you could say
the reason he's adopted by all of the international NGOs, Helsinki Group, Memorial, no, he was more than one oligarch. He was one individual who believed in the future of Russia and funded an opposition in Russia, including these human rights organizations. He funded them. He's funded the future in terms of putting Russia in a place where real reforms could take place. It's incredible to me that this latest notice to investors came out after Putin's new cabinet was announced. People understand where the real power in Moscow is, and that's with the men with epaulets.
And if it comes to a trial, what hope then do you have of a free and fair trial?
Right now, very little hope of a free and fair trial. But again, let's see what happens over the next few months.
You want Western observers at the trial?
Absolutely.
Do you think you'll get them?
I don't know.
What are the Russians saying?
We don't have anyone even to talk to right now. The Russian prosecutors themselves are acting in a manner that, to be frank with you, so departs from the rule of law that one of the key things we have to consider is whether or not to move in Europe, in Strasbourg, to try to stop this farce, because the conduct of the prosecution in Russia is illegal. You can't go attacking defense lawyers. You can't seize documents illegally. You can't put someone to the point of death and torture someone and then think you're going to go ahead and force a show trial.
Bob Amsterdam, good to have you on the program. Thanks very much.